Okay, chapter 5 of Theologico-Political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza is about the ceremonial law. Chapter 4 is about the divine law, and I did create a video on that. My last video was on divine law. Now, in chapter 5, it does clarify some things about divine law, and I think it's so that there's a clear difference between what divine law is and what ceremonial law is. So it tells us that divine law is the law that renders men to be truly blessed. It teaches about the true nature of life. It is innate and it is ingrained in our human mind. And it is the laws that all human beings recognize, even when nobody has really taught them about it. So that then becomes the divine law. It comes from God, and is the law that Baruch says that Prophet Isaiah kind of like summarizes what it is when he says in Isaiah chapter, I think it's chapter 1 verses 10, he says, okay, let me read the paragraphs, then we go into that particular verse. Baruch says, Isaiah teaches most plainly that the divine law in its strict sense signifies that universal law which consists in a true manner of life and does not signify ceremonial observations. In chapter 1 verses 10, Isaiah writes, cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed. So that's basically, Baruch says that is like the simplification of what the divine law is. But I would say a much better simplification of the divine law is what Jesus said, that love your God with all your heart or soul, and also love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that's like the simplification of what the divine law is. And Baruch says this law exists almost in every society. Like in every society, people recognize that you should do good to others. You shouldn't be selfish, for example. You should, all these laws that if you go to every society, is like they are recognized as how a decent human being should behave. Then they become like the divine law. Now, it's kind of like provided what I consider to be clarification of the divine law under the chapter on ceremonial law. And I guess he did this to just make it so that we are better equipped to understand what ceremonial law is. Now, on ceremonial law, he says these are laws that were ordained in the Old Testament, and they were ordained for the Hebrews only. Hebrews were the ones that were supposed to observe these laws, and they were adapted for their state, their commonwealth, and they were observed by the society as a whole, not by each individual. Like the society as a whole observed these laws. They form no part of the divine law and had nothing to do with the blessedness and virtue. Like by observing these ceremonial laws, you didn't stand to be blessed, or they didn't. It wasn't a way for you to express your virtue by following or observing these ceremonial laws. And it is these laws that reference the election of the Hebrews as a special nation. And he also says another nature of the ceremonial laws is that they provided bodily happiness and the tranquility of the kingdom. Like these laws promised immediate goodness, immediate happiness, and also they promised the well-being of the commonwealth. And he also explained that these laws were only valid as long as the kingdom of Israel existed or lasted. Once it ceased to exist, these laws kind of became irrelevant. And he says they were founded on revelation or basis of revelation. So looking at how he describes these ceremonial laws, we can say they were like what we'll have today is penal code in some countries, or in the countries we have today, or the constitution of a country. So you can call them ceremonial laws. So for the Jews, there were these ceremonial laws that were very important for the organization of their society, and also more importantly for the organization of the commonwealth, the nation, the state that the Jews had found. Now he also tries to contrast the ceremonial laws and the teachings of Jesus. He says, he writes, his sole care of Jesus, that is, was to teach moral doctrines and distinguish them from the laws of the state. For the Pharisees, their ignorance thought that the observation of the state law you can call them ceremonial laws, and the Mosaic law was the sum total of morality, whereas such laws merely had a reference to the public welfare and aimed not so much at instructing the Jews as to keeping them under constraint. I repeat that line, and aim not so much at instructing the Jews as at keeping them under constraint. Now, when I was reading this part, something came into my mind. There's this verse in the Bible where Jesus is trying to explain himself that he did not come to abolish the law or something like that. And there's this talk of the law to strengthen it or whatever. And that the context of that became clear reading this. Then I was clear in my mind. I'm now clear in my mind that Jesus was not teaching the state law that existed, that Moses established. And Moses Moses had his reasons to establish the ceremonial law because Moses was kind of like founding a state, while Jesus was not founding a state. He was basically teaching morals, and his message was basically to all humanity. But for Moses had a certain goal and role that he had to play. And in fact, Baruch explains to us, and he goes into this detail to tell us the purpose of a commonwealth, the state. And the purpose is one for protection, like for security purposes, because we need law and order. And then with law and order, then we get security. But he says there is more that the state does than just providing security. It also provides the basis of human interaction. And he says that's so important, in particular contracts. Contracts that people have to enter amongst themselves. And it says that's so important because as humans, we don't have the ability to do everything that we need to survive. We can't do the farming and then make the clothes and then do all these things. We have to do what is called division of labor. Some people do this, some people do this, some people do this, and then all of us are able to get everything that we need to be comfortable. And all that is possible, the division of labor is possible when there is state that we can enforce contracts. And he says that that's the importance of having the state. And that's why Moses had to create this state for security of the Jews and also for so to provide a conducive environment for them to get what they need in their day-to-day lives by entering into contracts with one another. And when they do that, then there is a state that has provided a mechanism of interacting. He also says, he gives us another explanation as to why these ceremonial laws were provided. Besides creating this environment for security and also for social interaction in terms of enterprise, he also says it was also important for Moses to find a way to incentivize the Jews to serve the state and to not to be compelled by punishment, but to be compelled by something higher, an higher ideal. And I found this to be so interesting because he says a state that uses force on its citizens doesn't survive for long, but one that incentivizes citizens to aspire for something bigger. So for example, he says for the state of Israel, there was this need of people to come out and fight for it and go to war on its behalf. They could not go to war and perform very well if they were just like, oh, the law has said we have to go and fight. But if they felt like they were fighting for the Lord, then they will go all out, and that was much better for the state. Now, something Baruch does that I found so interesting, and it gave me a different perspective, something that I never thought about, especially regarding Moses. He made me appreciate that Moses was a real genius, especially now when you think of him as a human being who had a responsibility of taking the Jewish people from Egypt, taking them to Canaan and helping them or guiding them or leading them into building this society, this state, commonwealth. And he explained in such a way that you realize that Moses was a real genius. And then you realize, you also appreciate how big obstacles he had in his way, because when the Jews was released from Egypt, they were basically freed slaves, and most of them didn't know much about how the state is run. They were just very ignorant people, you can say. But he takes these people, he takes them to the desert, and he somehow manages to lead them, and he manages to build a state that continues to exist long after he's dead. And that is so impressive that while I've read the story of Moses so many times, I have never appreciated that what he managed to do. I had never thought of the context of everything and how much work he needed to do and how much wisdom he needed and knowledge to take these people who were so ignorant and to build a state of them that existed long after he was gone. And in fact, he tells us that he brings us into seeing Moses as somebody who was operating in an environment like we have today. Like there was nothing really so divine about his actions and his whatever he was doing. He just says that, let me read a part of that. He says, he then, by the divine virtue he possessed, made laws and ordained them for the people, taking the greatest care that they should be obeyed willingly and not through fear. So the divine thing about him is his wisdom, really, not his actions or whatever. Was his wisdom. Like he didn't do things that are extraordinary in terms of how we see the world even today. What he was extraordinary, what was extraordinary about him is his wisdom and understanding of human nature, because he created laws that, yes, punished, but also promised. And that was so powerful, because then the commonwealth was able to survive. He continues saying, Moses, therefore, by his virtue and divine command, introduced religion so that the people might do their duty from devotion rather than fear. So through this wisdom of his, that the way I read it, even though he says divine command, the way he explains everything, it becomes clear that it was his wisdom that we can attribute, of course, to God, that he was able to build this society, that he knew what some people can call the game theory that you need to put in place so that a society functions seamlessly and well. He seemed to have been a very knowledgeable person. And in fact, he explains that while the rest of the Jews were ignorant, Moses was not. And in fact, when you read the Bible, you realize there's a reason why Moses was not really ignorant. This is a guy who was born and brought up not really born in, but brought up in the Egyptian royal family or high society, you might say, and he had the opportunity of learning, and so he was a knowledgeable person. Yeah, so that's chapter 5.